Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, podcast by a UFO nerd and his tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And I'm Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed video of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that we know the government has recovered non-human technology.
Or at least we will once more of Chris Mellon's signal conversations leak.
It raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
And they may still be unlikely. But even if it's new science and not aliens...
Woo! It's a very exciting time.
And quick reminder before we get into it, you can find our show notes at veryexcitingtime.com or support us by going to patreon.com/veryexcitingtime, where you can also find extra content like the Q&As that we've been recording.
Mm-hmm.
Need to change that intro sentence.
All right, Chuck, I've got a wild one for you today.
Yeah?
I'm going to take you on a freaking journey.
Okay. Hey, let's get weird.
You may remember last time we recorded, I mentioned there was so much stuff happening that we couldn't talk about it all. And one of the things I kind of teased was that after Sean Kirkpatrick leaked some of Chris Mellon's signal conversations, Chris Mellon himself released a screenshot of a signal conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I've broken our rule. I try real hard to introduce people. For anybody who's new here, Chris UFO Daddy Mellon is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, longtime supporter of a podcast. Hey, Chris, glad to have you with us. So yeah, he recently released a screenshot of a conversation with an unnamed government official, senior government official, who claimed to be gaining access to the secret UAP crash retrieval program.
Okay. I mean, that sounds good, but I feel like we hear stuff like that all the time.
It's true, but Chris was releasing this kind of in the context of like, I want you to understand why some of us still think there's something to this, even when Arrow is coming out and saying there's nothing here and the government is kind of slipping back into denial mode.
Okay, got it.
So Chris introduced this. He wrote a whole Substack post about it, but he said, recently, as a result of a FOIA request, the DoD released some signal exchanges I had with Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, the former director of Arrow. The release reminded me of another signal message that the public might find of interest that is also pertinent to the alleged recovery of off-world technology. Now, out of respect for the author's confidentiality, I have been sitting on this message for a number of years. I have also redacted portions of the document to protect the identity of the author. However, I recently obtained the author's written permission to release it, and it has also now been approved for public release by the Defense Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review, the DOPSR. My purpose in releasing this document, in the wake of the government's blanket denials regarding the possession of off-world technology, is simply to help others understand why I and some others consider these allegations worthy of investigation. Now,
that's interesting. That like he got permission, he took it through DOPSR, which for our listeners, most of them know DOPSR doesn't mean that they agree with the contents. Just that
nothing in it is leaking national secret.
Right. Or that nobody wants to claim.
Yeah, exactly.
There's secrets involved.
This was Grush's whole thing, is he said by putting his whole thing into DOPSR, he was kind of calling their bluff. Like, here it is. I'm saying that we have a secret illegal crash retrieval program. And if you want to deny it, you have to state on the record what agency is objecting to it and why, which, lets us take it in another legal direction. By not denying it, the government is kind of trying to imply that there's nothing to it, but also kind of tacitly giving it a thumbs up. It's a weird state to be in.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, what's in the content?
So the senior government official says, Redacted and I are making huge progress getting into the crash retrieval program. The Redacted would be slack-jawed if they found out what we now know. We're dealing with the recovered UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 50s.
Oh, wait. Okay. Have we talked about Kingman, Arizona in the 50s?
We have not, but we're gonna.
Okay.
We'll come back to that in a minute.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the government official continues. He says, we're vacuuming up info. We now know the management structure and security control systems and ownership of the crash retrieval program. We also know who recovers landed or crashed UAPs and under what authorities. We also know that a still highly classified memo by a secretary of the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s is still in effect to maintain the cover on UAPs.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that seems worthy of investigation.
Right. And I think this is the main thing, right? Like Mellon, especially more than anybody else in the field, is a pro at being very clear about what he's saying. He's not coming out and saying, you guys, aliens exist and I've seen them. He's coming out and saying, I know multiple credible witnesses who are saying there's something here and we should look into it. It is criminal not to look into it.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, as you can, Chris goes on to explain after the screenshot. He says, as you can see, this senior government official claimed that they were being granted access to an alleged U.S. alien technology recovery and exploitation program. I won't comment on the organization they worked for, but I can confirm the individual had plausible access and was high-ranking, considerably more so than whistleblower David Grush.
Wow. Okay, so like, that's a high bar because Grush had access to pretty much everything. Like, what else is left?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like he was preparing the presidential daily briefings. Like he was basically read into everything. So it's kind of wild to hear somebody higher than Grush had more access. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Mellon does end on a little bit of a down note. He says, it is important to note that this individual now claims that although they became aware of the program, they were ultimately denied access. The author of the message still believes there are recovered material, but admit that they could have not seen or touched a recovered craft. So, unfortunately, this individual would not be able to put this issue to rest, even if they were willing to come forward, which they are not.
You were such a tease. Okay. So, all right, tell me more about this UFO that
I just want to say, like, I think it's worth noting. This is the problem that we've been dealing with the whole time. And this is kind of the root of Grush's allegations and Admiral Wilson's allegations, right? Like that people find out that the program exists and people who should, on paper, according to our security protocols, be able to get access to it are denied access. So I don't want anybody to hear the fact that this person was denied access to the program to mean the program doesn't exist or nothing to see here. I want you to hear it as an echo of claims we have heard repeatedly from multiple other high-ranking, well-positioned individuals that they find out there is a program, they meet with the people running it, and are ultimately denied access in what they believe is improper fashion.
Which is, I think, what this is all really about.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, when we hear from people in Congress, they don't seem to particularly give a shit whether the public get to know about UFOs. They care about the fact that Congress doesn't know about UFOs.
Yeah. Or that they're, even if they aren't UFOs, that there's stuff they're not allowed to talk about, which is not how it's supposed to be.
Okay. So
do you want to tell me about the UFO thing?
Yeah, man. So
okay.
I probably wouldn't have brought this to you because I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like, it kind of feels like a nothing burger. Like, okay, Chris talked to a guy who didn't get access to a program. Like, why are we discussing
What?
this?
Okay.
Any people who are kind of embedded in the UFO community, their ears perked up at the mention of Kingman, Arizona. This is a legendary and controversial case.
Okay.
So Roswell, pretty much everyone agrees something happened in Roswell. The government has changed their story on Roswell something like 7 times, but we have this mountain of evidence and witnesses in the area who talked about military cover-ups, and it feels very authentic that something happened. The military was still kind of getting their shit together on how do we deal with this stuff? How do we cover it up? They made some missteps, and over the years, they've been forced to claim all sorts of wild things about it. But unless you take the government's line at its word, which I should be clear, most people don't, pretty much everyone agrees something crashed in Roswell in 47.
Okay.
Kingman, I want to be upfront with you, is not that clear cut.
Okay.
There is a ton of information here. In a nutshell, we've got a series of witnesses, some of whom are, I feel, extremely credible, and a range of claims from the plausible to the frankly outrageous. There's so much. We're going to focus on the story of 3 witnesses who came out to tell different stories that are all connected to this alleged crash in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. I want to be clear. There's way, way, way more to this story. People have been talking about it since the 60s. I am not bringing you a lot of the stuff that even I look at. I'm like, yeah, that's a load of horse shit. No. I'm bringing you 3 people, and I think you're not going to buy into all of them. And that's fine. I'm building to a point.
Cool.
So our first witness is a guy named Arthur Stansel, who talks about the UFO retrieval itself. In 1973, UFO researcher Raymond Fowler tracked down Arthur Stansel, who had been interviewed a couple times at this point and claimed to have been involved in a UFO crash retrieval 20 years earlier. At that time, Stansel was working as an engineer for, this is a bit of a mouthful, the Office of Special Studies in the Air Force Air Material Command out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was on special assignment to the Atomic Energy Commission for Operation Upshot Knothole, which was a series of nuclear weapon tests in the Nevada Proving Ground. Stansel was there to study blast effects on buildings and structures.
Wow. Okay. So not a job I would want to do, but it sounds fascinating. And I'll say, like, he must have had all the clearances, right?
Maybe it's hard to tell. So this is post World War II. Atomic stuff is still top secret, but Upshot Knothole is well documented. There was something like 20,000 military personnel involved in this program.
So this isn't like Manhattan Project.
No. This is a bigger. This is more kind of weapon testing phase. And there are a lot of people.
When is
Stansel's there to do one very particular thing, right? They're building structures in the desert and testing what happens when an atomic bomb hits them. And these were aerial tests that they were doing. So it was even more scoped in. They already had a good idea what the nuclear blast was like, but anyway. Point is, Stansel and all of his credentials have been verified. He was stationed where he said he was. He's a World War II veteran of the D-Day landings. He has a master's degree in engineering. By all reports, he's a highly credible witness. Now, the fact that we've been able to verify his military service and that he was part of Operation Upshot Knothole and he was where he was on all the dates that he said he was, doesn't mean that everything he's about to say is true, but it lends credibility to him. Like we talked a lot when we talked about Bob Lazar, that the fact that Bob claims to have certain educational credentials that we can't verify makes it a little harder to go with him all the way on all of his claims.
Right.
Not the case here with Stansel. He seems to be a very good witness.
Sure, but so the remaining confounding factor is it's been 20 years, right?
It was 20 years at the time. It's now been, 50, 70 years. Yeah.
But we're talking about a thing that was done in 73, right?
Yeah, he was interviewed in 73 about events in 53. So,
cool.
Stansel says on May 21st, 1953, he was called away by his boss and told to report for a special assignment with 15 other specialists. They were flown by military plane to Phoenix, where they boarded a bus with blacked out windows and rode for about 4 hours. When they arrived at their destination, they were met and briefed by an Air Force colonel who told them that they were there to investigate the crash of a super secret test vehicle. He and the others on the bus were told not to speak to each other under any circumstances.
This is interesting. Like, I actually cannot tell whether this would be standard procedure or if it's really weird. Like, test plane goes down, put a bunch of unrelated specialists in a blackout bus, drive them to the middle of nowhere, don't talk to each other. But now that I've been read into a program at work, the amount of tedium and like bullshit that happened around that, in many cases, I would actually prefer to be in a blacked out bus where I can't talk to anyone and just give my report and be the fuck out of there. Like, I don't want to have to worry about why this is here. I just want to do my research and go home to my family.
We'll get to this in a minute when we talk about what Stansel was there to do. But in a nutshell, this is a bus of specialists who are not in the program developing the test vehicle.
Sure.
That reads weird to me, right? Like, if you're developing a secret jet, you're going to have people who know propulsion and metallurgy and things like that. So the weird part to me is not the secrecy. The weird part is grabbing 15 random specialists from elsewhere in the military, throwing them on a bus and bringing them in the middle of nowhere to look at a crash site that your own team is looking at. Like, that seems very weird to me. Now, as we've said many times before, the fuck do I know? I'm just a web developer. I've never been in the military. I've certainly never been involved in any top secret programs. Maybe this is totally standard, but it feels weird.
Yeah. For our program, like, we did this a lot, and it was like, hey, can't tell you why, but we need you to do this thing. And we had to come up with why we would pick those people for that project. But in many cases, we didn't even really get to tell them why. So they may not be as random as you would think. It may just be like, oh yeah, I know Arthur will know this.
I guess I mean random in the sense that they are not part of the program that is developing the vehicle.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it's you're entirely right. They probably do have most of the specialists they need, but maybe they don't have someone who's good at blast angles.
Yeah. Now,
I don't know.
Stansel's job was to determine the forward and vertical velocities of the vehicle when it impacted into the sand. He was escorted onto the site by 2 military police. 2 military arc lights illuminated a saucer, which appeared to be 2 convex oval plates inverted over each other. So standard flying saucer. Each approximately 30 feet in diameter.
Yeah. I mean, sounds exactly like the normal Air Force test vehicle, I'm sure.
Yeah, totally the kind of thing they were developing in the 50s. Yeah. So Stansel gave Fowler, the researcher, a signed affidavit. He said, during a special assignment with the U.S. Air Force on May 21st, 1953, I assisted in the investigation of a crashed, unknown object in the vicinity of Kingman, Arizona. The object was constructed of an unfamiliar metal which resembled brushed aluminum. It had impacted 20 inches into the sand without any sign of structural damage.
Ooh, that's interesting. No damage.
Right? Stansel said, based on the angle and how far it was buried in the ground, he estimated that it hit the ground at 1,200 miles per hour.
So there were two things I think I thought about there. So first, like 1,200 miles per hour is like Mach 1.5 or so. Anyways, it's about the speed of modern jets. But when they hit the ground, there's not much left.
Yeah, there's a grease. Yeah,
exactly. But compared to something coming in at orbital velocity, or from from further, like that's nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're thinking in terms of conventional rocketry and our approach to going to space, if you're thinking this is an extrasolar object and it hit the ground, it's coming in a lot hotter than 1,200 miles an hour. Right. At 1,200 miles per hour, like it's fast, but we at the time, I think, had a couple of things that could go faster than that. And now many things go faster than that. But, like commercial airliners, I think I read that 800 miles per hour was like the speed record for one of those, so 1,200 miles per hour is a speed we understand, and we understand what happens when things going that fast hit the ground. And then, as Chuck said, there's nothing left. There is at best a debris field, but there's not going to be like a solid, basically undamaged plane. There just isn't at those speeds. And he's very clear. This thing is just there, just planted in the ground.
It makes me wonder if it was like, if there was a point when Stansel was like, was this planted here? Just to see like what we would say.
It's
like,
so weird, right?
Yeah.
I will say a lot of people have theorized that you mentioned orbital velocity would be a lot faster than this, that these things were not, in fact, coming from orbit, which raises a possibility either this is a human thing, or even if you still think this is alien, these are more like scout craft that are moving around in the atmosphere, moving at, atmospheric speeds. Yeah. So anyway, either way, weird thing to find out in the desert, planted in the ground, having hit at a high but not absurd velocity and still completely intact.
Yeah.
Stansel goes on to describe, he says, an entryway hatch had been vertically lowered and opened. It was about 3.5 feet high and 1.5 feet wide. I was able to talk briefly with someone on the team who did look inside only briefly. He saw 2 swivel seats, an oval cabin, and a lot of instruments and displays.
So it had 2 seats and a like a weirdly tiny hatch, like 1.5 feet wide. Like, that's like, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's a spacecraft. Those had tiny craft. Okay, so it had seats. Were there any crew?
A tent pitched near the object sheltered the dead remains of the only occupant of the craft. It was about 4 feet tall, dark brown complexion, had 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, and a small mouth. It was clothed in a silvery metallic suit and wore a skull cap of the same type of material. It had no face covering or helmet.
No helmet. So, brown skin, no like sulfur smell was mentioned, no mention of oversized eyes. This isn't like our normal alien, right?
Doesn't seem to be. Yeah. Now, I will note the Kingman crash is a messy thing. We're talking about Stansel. This is what Stansel said. Other witnesses describe a larger hatch, but not much larger. And if you're dealing with smaller beings in the range of 4 feet, 1.5 by 3.5 isn't as small as it sounds to, a full-size human, but it's still small. But I think the thing to take away from is there was an open hatch. There's things that are recognizably seats and controls inside, but the hatch is weirdly small. And you don't see what you would see in like a jet or a helicopter or anything that we made at the time with, a lot of like seatbelts and like human readable displays. Like, this is something different, like swivel chairs.
Yeah.
That's not what we put in things that we fly at 1,200 miles per hour, like a little like desk chair.
Yeah. So I just looked it up. The Gemini capsule was almost exactly those dimensions for the hatch.
Oh, that's interesting.
But you know, they had to like crawl in sideways.
Absolutely. Yeah. It wasn't a comfortable entry.
It wasn't comfortable. But, you know, if, as you say, it's like a little scout craft, like maybe that's the appropriate size.
Yeah. So, yeah, weird craft, weird interior, dead alien being, but the description of the alien doesn't really match any of our kind of like quote unquote standard aliens that we're familiar with from other witnesses. On the bus ride back, all of the specialists were made to sign the Official Secrets Act and told to never tell anyone about the incident.
So I'm surprised they didn't sign that beforehand. But also, why is he talking about it now? Like, is he just done with life?
That's a good question. This is going to come up with a couple of the witnesses that we talk about today. It seems to be that they were given the impression that this was not a forever. It was for like a period of years after you retire kind of thing. The next witness we talk about was specifically under the impression that he was cleared to talk after 2003.
Oh, interesting.
It's just very weird. Now, Stansel doesn't say that. The impression that I get from him is he was a guy who liked to tell a story. And at first he was operating under a pseudonym, like the signed affidavit that he gave to the UFO researcher. When the UFO researcher told his story, he gave him a fake name. Now, he came out later. Why? Great question. Yeah. A little unclear.
So, I was just Googling the Official Secrets Act, and Wikipedia says that the US doesn't have an Official Secrets Act.
So I will note that was me quoting from an article. I read 3 different descriptions of what happened to Stansel afterwards. Now, all of them fall under after he left the scene, he was instructed not to tell anyone about this.
Okay.
That's universal.
I can buy that.
One article mentioned that they all had to raise their hand and swear an oath. Another mentioned they had to sign, something. Another one mentioned that an Army colonel told Stansel to fill out his report in longhand, meaning no typewriter, no copies, and hand it directly to a particular airman who was coming to get it. And that after that, he was unable to tell anyone about it. So, but they all boil down to the same thing. He's bussed out to the middle of nowhere in a bus with blacked out windows, so they don't want him to know exactly where he is, and told not to talk to any of the other people on the bus and not to talk to anyone else about it afterwards.
Totally makes sense.
Right?
And
now, there are some collaborating witnesses to Stansel's story. These ones aren't quite as compelling on their own, but they kind of like add a little buffering to Stansel's version. In an article in 1978, UFO researcher Charles Wilhelm said that his father heard a nearly identical story from a Major Daly. Daly said that he was placed on a bus and blindfolded, then driven into the desert, where he saw an undamaged metallic craft about 30 feet across with an open hatch about 3 feet wide. After concluding his analysis, Daly was taken from the area by an escort.
Okay. I mean, that's close.
Lines up, right? Now, there are little details, like he remembers being blindfolded, the size of the hatch is different, but the nut of the story, I was put on a bus and taken to a crashed UFO and told not to talk about it, is all there.
And 25 years is a long time for that thing to shift.
Absolutely. The other one is, in 1977, UFO researcher Leonard Stringfeld spoke with a pilot who saw bodies recovered from a crash in the Arizona desert, delivered to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at night by a DC-7. And this is a quote from Stringfield. Quote, he recalled that he stood inside a hangar at a distance of about 12 feet, peering at 5 crates on a forklift. In his judgment, the crates appeared to be hastily constructed and were made of wood. In 3 of these, little humanoids, appearing to be 4 feet tall, were lying unshrouded on a fabric, which he explained prevented freeze burn from the dry ice that was packed under them. As a number of air police stood silent guard near the crates, he managed to get a reasonably good but brief glimpse of the humanoid features. He recalls that their heads were hairless and narrow, and by human standards were disproportionately large, with skin that appeared brown under the hangar lights above. The eyes seemed to be open, the mouth small, and the nose, if any, was indistinct. My informant also heard from the crew member that one of the entities was still alive aboard the craft when the U.S. military team arrived. Attempts were made to save its life with oxygen, but they were unsuccessful.
This is fascinating, but also, given the level of secrecy, I'm surprised that anyone was allowed within 12 feet, including the air guard.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's very weird.
But it's interesting to hear that there were more bodies too, and maybe survivors.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to, we've heard a similar story from Jesse Marcel, that he was stationed at the base where the Roswell wreckage was brought, and that basically, after dark, him and another couple guys snuck in to look at it. The impression I get is, in the early 50s, they were still kind of getting their shit together about how secret this should be and under how strict a guard it should be kept and stuff.
That makes sense.
Yeah, the number of crew, whether or not they survived, varies a little bit depending on which witness you're talking to. So it's worth kind of recapping and coming back to Stansel himself, the witness that I'm bringing you, only claims to have seen a single body. He doesn't make any claims about how many crew there were total. He just says he saw a single body. Maybe the rest of them lived and they had already been taken away. Who knows? Right. But by the time he got there, he claims there's a single body in a tent and an unoccupied craft.
Okay, cool.
So let's move on to our next witness.
Okay.
And I think you're going to like this one. So one of the 2001 Disclosure Project witnesses was Bill Uhouse, who is a retired pilot in the Marine Corps. He says that after he left the Marines, he was working with the Air Force out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base doing experimental flight testing. He was approached and asked if he wanted to work in an area on, quote, new creative devices. He and several others were reassigned to Link Aviation, which was a flight simulator manufacturer.
Okay. So I looked this up. The Link trainer, which is named after its creator, Edwin Link, not because it links things together, it's not linked to an airplane or something. The Link trainer debuted in 1929. It's heavily in use around the world. But it was all analog, had bellows and pneumatics and stuff. So was the creative part that they were working on a computerized version, or what was
That's a great question, and it's a reasonable assumption given that in modern times our association with flight simulators is a video game from Microsoft, or big digital screens and maybe a joystick. But no, you hit the nail on the head. Back in the 50s, everything was mechanical and analog. You would actually have a cockpit up on gimbals and things like that. But no, the creative thing they were working on is that the simulator was for a flying saucer.
Okay. All right. That is a very new creative device.
Yeah. Now, I want to be clear. Bill Uhouse is kind of a wild guy. I have some quotes in here from Uhouse himself, but I've also got a bunch of kind of quotes from articles that were written about him over the years. And I've had to cut and paste snippets together from all over the place to get a coherent story. Aside from his testimony to the Disclosure Project, one of the main sources was a publication from the 90s called the Groom Lake Desert Rat, which interviewed him repeatedly. The Groom Lake Desert Rat was a very kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Okay.
I wouldn't say tongue-in-cheek. They were very serious. They were, investigating Area 51 claims, but they also didn't take themselves too seriously. It's full of in-jokes and everything. They referred to Uhouse under a pseudonym of J-Rod, which they spelled Jared, but everybody else in the world spells it as J-Rod, which we'll get to later. Like I said, this story is kind of a mess. I've put it together as coherently as I can. There are links in the description if you want to know more. But yeah, Bill Uhouse is a wild guy. So Uhouse is a retired, this is a quote from one of those interviews.
Okay.
Uhouse is a retired engineer who claims to have worked for over 30 years on a project to build flight simulators for human reproductions of alien spacecraft. As he explains it, when any kind of aircraft is in development, a flight simulator is built in parallel with it to train pilots and test systems. He defines a simulator as something that simulates an actual device or craft to enable the operator to reproduce conditions or phenomena likely to occur in actual performance.
So I had never thought about this, that you would have to develop that in tandem. Like, I thought you would have to like get it flying to understand how it would perform in order to get the like pneumatics right. But then how do you train pilots to fly it so they can figure out if it feels right? Like,
I don't think it's universal that they've always developed the simulators in lockstep with it, like especially in the early days of flying. I think it was a little more like, I don't know, let's strap a rocket on this thing and see what happens. But by the time the 50s roll around, post World War II, I think they had a little bit more of a process going on. They knew what jets were, and they're refining and making better versions of them. And because they're improving the capabilities, they want to make a simulator to take the existing pilots and show them what's different about this jet. So this is going to do G-forces. You want to be able to simulate that for the pilot, things like that. What does a dive feel like?
Right. Yeah. And I bet that there's multiple different levels of it too. There's like the training you do before it's ever been up in the sky is more like, all right, where are the buttons? It doesn't need pneumatics or anything. It's just like, all right, let's get you in a cockpit that looks similar so we can see if your knees hit anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is a quote from Uhouse himself. He says, I don't think any flying disc simulators went into operation until the early 60s, maybe 62, 63, because the simulator wasn't actually functional until around 1958. The simulator that was based on a 10-meter extraterrestrial craft that crashed in Kingman, Arizona back in 53. That's the first one that they took out for a test flight.
Oh, interesting. So that's like a connection to Kingman, but also test flight?
Yeah. So Uhouse's claim is that they have recovered a flying saucer, but they can't fly it. For one thing, it's built for 4 feet tall pilots, but also like it has alien interfaces. So they're making human reproductions of the vehicles.
Okay.
And he talks about this a little bit, that they're putting human understandable aeronautics in to control the alien craft, but they're developing the flight simulator for the human reproduction of the vehicle. And it's all based on the craft recovered in Kingman.
Interesting. Okay. Wild.
From the article again, the simulator he worked on was identical in appearance to the actual craft, except it was attached to the ground through a gimbaled base. These simulators are used to train pilots to fly the craft, but they're more than just a cockpit. They reproduce the entire craft inside and out. The simulators closely match the kind of craft Lazar describes, with a reactor in the middle and 3 gravity amplifiers below deck.
What is the connection to Lazar?
This is the kind of craft that Lazar has described. Maybe we didn't talk about this recently enough for you to remember, but Lazar gets really into the mechanics of the craft, and like here are the gravity emitters, and they're, they can kind of swivel around and make the craft go in any direction. And it tends to fly on its side, and,
Okay. So someone reading this zine maybe would absolutely know what that meant and who Lazar was.
Oh, absolutely. And he's coming out within a year or two of Lazar hitting the mainstream. So anybody reading an Area 51 newsletter is intimately familiar with Lazar's claims. And remember, at the time, the government still denied that there was a facility at Area 51. That only came out much later. For a long time, it wasn't just, no, we're not doing alien shit at Area 51. It was, there is no such facility. So, the fact that Bill Uhouse has a connection to Lazar is a pro or a con, depending on how you feel about Lazar. And we've talked before, I don't know how to feel about Lazar. He's a complicated witness, and it's okay to have mixed feelings about him. I will note, this is the only connection to Lazar, and the fact that he was working at Area 51, but that part has since proven true. So Uhouse said, the disk simulator did not have a reactor, but we had a space in it that looked like the reactor. That wasn't the device we operated the simulator with. We operated it with 6 large capacitors that were charged with 1 million volts each, so that there were 6 million volts in these capacitors. They were the largest capacitors ever built at the time. These particular capacitors, they would last for 30 minutes, so you could get in there and actually work the controls and do what you had to get the simulator, the disk, to operate.
I don't understand this at all. Like, why would you need that much stored energy for a simulator? Or why would you need the reactor there? Or like it talks about the simulator being attached to ground. Like, is it supposed to fly? Like what?
No, you are hitting the nail on the head. So, and they talk about this in the interviews. People are like, why would you need to, like, he describes how the capacitors are mounted in the craft itself. And they're like, why wouldn't you just run a cable to it? And I think if you're thinking of a traditional flight simulator, a mechanical flight simulator, that's basically a cockpit on a gimbal, it doesn't have the jet. It has the seat and the controls, and it'll do some movements to emulate what the jet would do when you interact with the controls. It's easy to imagine that. Uhouse goes into a lot of detail in these interviews about the mechanics of the craft. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds, because this article this episode is really about Kingman. But in a nutshell, the impression that I've got is the big thing about this craft is that it's anti-gravity. So when it does like a 60-degree tilt, when you do that in a traditional flight simulator gimbal, you want the pilot to feel that they're at 60 degrees. But in this craft, they won't feel that because the gravity field holds them to the deck. And someone asks at one point, like, okay, well, why make it on a gimbal at all if they're never going to feel it? Uhouse doesn't answer that, but the article speculates that what's happening is you are controlling the direction of the gravity field. So you need to get a feel for how to move the gravity field as it rocks. So you actually need to feel the gravity. All of this is speculation. You are totally right to hit on, this is a weird simulator.
Okay. All right. Fair. I can accept that.
Yeah. And as for why they need this much power, we've talked before about claims from whistleblowers that, like, for example, the reactor from a single scout craft has enough output to power the entire US for a year, like that kind of thing. The impression I get is they're trying to build the simulator to be as close as humanly possible to an actual craft without actually flying it around. But as you and I know from other witnesses, the actual functional reactors from these craft are incredibly valuable. We don't know how to make them. So if they've got a single recovered vehicle with a single reactor, maybe they've figured out how to make a couple more. They certainly don't have any to spare for the flight simulator. So I think what you're hearing here is these massive capacitors are a hack to keep the system working the same way, where it just expects to have access to an insane amount of power.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. Uhouse goes on to say, so it wasn't that simple because we only had 30 minutes. Okay. But in the simulator, you'll notice there are no seatbelts, right? And it was the same thing in the actual craft. No seatbelts. You don't need seatbelts because when you fly one of these things upside down, there is no upside down like in a regular aircraft. You just don't feel it. There's a simple explanation for that. You have your own gravitational field inside the craft. So if you're flying upside down, to you, you're right side up.
This sounds so fucking far-fetched to me. Like, the simulator still needs to be safe. All right, maybe it has anti-gravity, but like, why not just throw a seatbelt in there to keep the pilots safe? Like,
yes.
Did they also wear silver suits and no helmets?
I am not trying to justify this story. It's a weird story, and you are correctly picking up on the weird vibes of it.
Okay, cool.
If you want to give him credit, I think the most I could say is probably, this is a man who retired years ago, is giving an interview to an enthusiast publication.
Sure.
And probably is like, yeah, there was gravity, man. Don't worry about it. There are probably technical explanations here that would make more sense if we had more context. Maybe. Or it's all bullshit. But yeah, so he's making wild claims here that basically boil down to the Kingman UFO was recovered. They reverse engineered it and made human craft out of it. And he worked on the flight simulator for it. At one point, someone asks him, did you ever get in the real craft? He said, I was inside the actual alien craft for a startup. Each engineer that had anything to do with the design was part of the startup crew because we had to be able to verify any of the equipment we put in to make sure that it worked like in the real craft. Because the disk has its own gravitational field, you would be sick or distorted for about 2 minutes after getting in, after it was cranked up. It takes a lot of time to get used to it.
I 100% believe that. Like, humans do not do well with changing gravity. So, fun fact, I read a couple stories where they talk about being on the ISS, the International Space Station. And they, in the beginning, people would float around in whatever direction they wanted, but it caused videos to people on the ground. To like, the people on the ground would start feeling sick, but also people on the space station, if they like floated into a room and everyone was upside down, they'd get a sudden, like, their brain would switch and be like, oh shit, I should be falling, and they would get sick immediately. So they've ended up picking a direction. There is an up in the ISS, which is fascinating to me.
Isn't it interesting? Yeah.
No,
it's totally wild. And it's like, it's physiological, but it's also kind of just etiquette. Like, just kind of rude to be upside down while everyone else is oriented. Yeah. I love that.
I feel like they should, though, always have one person just to like prove every photo.
The wild card.
Yeah.
I mentioned this before, but Uhouse says the alien control systems in the original craft, which are unusable to our pilots, have been replaced by the sort of avionics that our engineers are already familiar with.
Sure. But how do you work out like all the technical problems of integrating with that kind of system? Like,
it sounds tricky, right? Like, we're back in an Independence Day situation of, like, oh, I uploaded a virus to the alien mainframe, or Jurassic Park. Like, oh, this is Unix. I know this. The likelihood that anything in an alien control scheme would be at all compatible with humans, even to the point of us being able to understand it and make our own version of it, is pretty wild.
Seems unlikely.
So it's funny you should mention that. Uhouse claims they had a technical advisor.
Oh, of course.
Uhouse says, we had meetings, and I ended up meeting with an alien. They called him J-Rod. I don't know if that was his real name or not, but that's the name the linguist gave him. The alien used to come in with Dr. Edward Teller and some of the other guys occasionally to handle questions that maybe we'd have. Yeah, I bet they had some questions.
Just a few.
But you have to understand that everything was specific to the group. If it wasn't specific to our responsibility, mechanical design for the avionics on the flight deck for the disk simulators, you could not talk about. It was strict need-to-know basis.
Damn it, Uhouse. Stop asking the alien questions about his home life. That's not why we're here.
Uhouse continues, he says, so basically the alien was only giving engineering advice and science advice. You'd get to a spot where you would try and it wouldn't work. And that's when the alien would come in and they would tell him, look at this and see what we did wrong. And in some cases, our alien advisors could help us with a technical problem, but won't. Like a school teacher withholding the solution to a math problem. They seemed to want us to figure things out for ourselves, so we gain the skills for future use.
It's like being a technical advisor to an engineering team entirely composed of kindergartners trying to build a truck. It's like, why can't you power the engine with Capri Sun? Like, I don't even know. You try it. You know what? Fuck it. Go try it.
Right? For the last time, those popsicle sticks do not have the torque strength to hold up to perform as an axle.
Exactly. Oh my God. Okay. Let's carry on. How did they talk? Was it psychic or?
That is a great question. And yeah, we've talked a lot before about how, most people who report encountering aliens report psychic communication. But Uhouse is very clear that J-Rod spoke audibly. And he would perfectly mimic your voice like a parrot.
Oh, weird.
So he didn't communicate psychically, but Uhouse did say that he would answer your question almost before you finished asking it.
That it sounds like that Zoom call where everyone's just like a little bit too delayed and you just end up like echoing each other or what. Yeah. So, okay. What did he look like?
So not ironically, funny, Uhouse made a sketch of J-Rod.
Oh.
And the newsletter kind of describes it. He said, we have a sketch of J-Rod drawn by Uhouse. J-Rod is a gray, like you've probably seen on UFO shows on TV. He has a large, round, hairless head with an expressionless slit for a mouth, 2 small holes for a nose, and big black wraparound eyes. He has 4 long fingers on each hand, ending in a very long Howard Hughes-style nails. Unlike on television, this gray is dressed in human clothing. He is wearing a button-down shirt and is shown in the sketch in a relaxed, human-like posture, as though sitting behind a desk. Uhouse explains that the street clothes are intended only to put at ease the humans who must interact with the alien.
Oh my God.
You've got to look at the sketch, by the way. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a gray wearing a button-up shirt. Like, it's amazing.
With such a prominent feature like a giant head, I feel like I would have chosen to just like steer into it, like pop collar, like a mohawk, like really, really make it pop.
Right? Like, who was involved in picking out the wardrobe for the gray? Right? Like, was this the Gray's idea? Was he like, could I get a shirt and necktie? I feel like an asshole here.
Nobody respects me if I don't look like a middle manager.
Right. The newsletter continues. They said, this was a very long-term project that started in the mid-50s, shortly before Uhouse joined it. The organization was heavily compartmentalized, and he knows only as much as he needed to know to do his job. Working on such an exotic technology, however, the workers had to know at least the basics of where it came from. Briefings over the years confirmed that the technology was indeed extraterrestrial. He and his coworkers were told about early contacts between the aliens and our military, but they were not told about the alien agenda or what was happening in the present day.
Alien agenda. Okay. Yeah. So What did he talk about? What he learned?
Yeah, so he kind of gave a brief summary of how these aliens came to be working with them as like advisors.
Yeah.
He says the vessel that fell in Arizona in 1953 contained 4 entities. 2 were disabled and 2 were reasonably well, but somewhat confused. All of the entities were later taken to Los Alamos labs in New Mexico for medical treatment and tests. The entities, referred to as the boys, were secured in a medical facility that was manned by doctors, physicists, chemists, and linguists. Initially, communications were limited to a basic sign language. I should point out, there is a story that may be apocryphal that someone else reported that the origin of the name J-Rod came from this period when they didn't have a good way to talk. And they were just putting up like flashcards with symbols on them. And the first symbol that one of the aliens pointed to was the letter J. And the next was, it's unclear. The description said an inertial dampener rod. Like, I think they were just showing them like parts of a plane or something. But so they called the aliens J-Rod. Is that true? I have no idea, but it's one of those little ideas that kind of delights me. Like, do you know what this is?
Oh, yes, that one.
What about
That's
this?
me.
Oh, the alien likes the letter J.
Okay. Like, what is in that flashcard deck? It's like alphabet letters and airplane parts. Like,
I know. Very strange, right? He said the first significant communication was between the bioastronautic engineer. Never heard that word before, but all right. Bioastronautic engineer. And the tallest entity of the 4, who was dubbed Smiling Eyes. The boys wanted to return to their vessel, and after much deliberation, it was agreed to take them to the Nevada test site where the vessel was now located.
Sorry, I'm reading about bioastronautics now. Wait, so you said to the Nevada test site? Like, like Area 51?
That's it, baby! Area 51, baby! Yeah, now, we know through official records that Area 51 was in existence by 1955. It was used as test range for, I forget whatever plane they were developing at the time.
Blackbird,
there are rumors in the community that Area 51 was at least a collection of buildings as early as 1953, and that the craft had been taken there to be secured out in the middle of nowhere. Uhouse continues. He said,
yeah. It was the SR-71 Blackbird and the U-2.
There it is. Yeah. Uhouse says a request was made by the leader of the boys that they be housed at the test site with their vehicle. And they made additional requests for material, equipment, and literature. And so began a new era. Selection of personnel in the organization was directed by the visitors. They insisted that the leader was to be the bioastronomical engineer who first made contact. Uhouse says, you cannot imagine the situation that this caused. It was like putting a private in charge of the generals. Nearly all of the appointments were selected from the science field.
That's awesome. Like, that is exactly how I would do it if I was an alien too. Like, now don't bring them over here. I just want to talk to the scientists and the engineers.
Send these suits away from my island. I don't want to interact with them. Bring me the guy who understands basic science.
Yeah, exactly. I 100% agree with that.
Bring me the smartest of the kindergartners.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So, buddy, if you thought that Uhouse's claims were stretching your belief, have I got a story for you?
Okay.
Time for us to get weird.
I'm ready. Let's get weird.
Third witness, Dan Burisch.
Okay.
So Dan Burisch is an extremely controversial witness. And he describes that he worked at Area 51 in the mid-90s doing medical procedures with an alien named J-Rod.
Wait, the same? Like 40 years later, same alien?
it appears that J-Rod is a designation for the type of entity, which makes a little sense given the story about like pick a name.
Yeah.
But most people who talk about J-Rod refer to J-Rod as if it is an individual. I was only able to find some references that imply this is like a species designation. Burisch has some pretty specific claims about their species. But yeah, there appear to be multiple J-Rods. There's the one working as a technical advisor to Bill Uhouse's team back in the 50s through the 80s. And then there's the one that Dan Burisch works with in the 90s and maybe more.
Yeah. Okay. I really hope that this is like a scientific exchange program. Like they're just sending over new friends
to like crash landing survivors who are being held hostage. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but I would not be surprised by either, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, now here's the thing. Burisch's story gets buck wild. Absolutely bonkers. It involves time travel, multiverse stuff, cities on Mars, Majestic 12, the government erasing his PhD, and an attempt to erase his memories.
Okay. Yeah. All right. It's time to get weird.
I know. But here's the thing. We cannot talk about Kingman without talking about Uhouse's reverse engineering program. And we can't talk about that without talking about J-Rod. And anybody in the community who hears J-Rod is not going to be able to think about that without talking about Dan Burisch. So I'm going to keep it focused on his interactions with J-Rod and leave some of the messier stuff off to the side. I'm being honest with you. It's there. And I don't blame you.
Okay.
Let's feeling weird about it. But let's talk about his story about working with J-Rod.
Sounds good.
So Burisch claims to have worked as a microbiologist at the S4 facility in Area 51 in a program studying the species-wide neuropathy, which is just a fancy word for nerve damage, of an alien kept in a clean containment unit. From an article, quote, Dan began to work as part of the Aquarius J-Rod team that was tasked with the problem of figuring out why the J-Rods, commonly called Greys, were suffering from a debilitating medical condition that affected their nerves. Part of this work involved taking physical tissue samples from the J-Rod housed deep below S4 in a clean sphere designed to support his atmospheric and environmental needs.
Why was this alien in a clean room, but the other one was like tromping around town in button-ups and taking meetings with engineers? And
that is a very good question with no good answer.
Okay. All right.
Trying to give credit to it. Uhouse was meeting with a Gray in the, between the 50s and the early 80s. Burisch is meeting with them in the 90s. Maybe he just got old, condition deteriorated.
Yeah, all right.
Maybe they're from different species. Burisch talks about multiple groups of Greys from different timelines. Maybe the one working with Uhouse is from a different timeline than the one Burisch is working with. Like I said, this story gets buck wild.
Okay.
But all short answer, there's no good answer.
Okay.
Dan was introduced into the protocols surrounding the J-Rod by having him be part of the backup team, while his supervisor, Stephen, would suit up and go in to do the tissue sample removals. However, the J-Rod began to reject Stephen and make demands that Dan be allowed to suit up and enter the clean sphere for the tissue samples instead. This created some immediate problems in the team structure, as Dan was the newest member and not nearly senior enough in time or experience for such a responsibility. But the J-Rod was insistent. Dan was rapidly promoted within the team and soon found himself being trained in the protocols necessary for entering the clean sphere to work directly with the J-Rod.
I keep hearing the J-Rod. I'm like, God, that's such a tech bro name. Like, oh, you can
it really is.
Call me the J-Rod.
Yeah, the J-Rod came back in time to tell us to invest in Dogecoin.
Right, exactly. Oh God. But it does kind of repeat what Uhouse said about aliens picking the person they wanted. We don't really know why.
Well, funny story.
Oh, okay.
It was later learned that the reason this J-Rod insisted on this change of personnel was because he recognized Dan as one of the abducted children on the craft he had been aboard back in the early 70s.
All right.
The article says, it's always difficult to explain this, since discussing the movement through time as well as space is difficult. But this particular J-Rod had been traveling in the company of a group of P-45s, a J-Rod group originating approximately 45,000 years in the future, who were doing the abduction sampling that day in the early 70s. He then traveled back to 1953 on a different mission, which ended in a crash near Kingman, Arizona. He was recovered from that crash location and taken to S4 and housed there. As a result of his presence on the craft when Dan was abducted, he felt a strong connection to Dan.
Sure. Okay, why not? So,
I want to be clear, that sure is Chuck looking at the notes I've written for him and just going, yeah, okay, whatever.
Like, resigning myself to this. Let's let it wash over. Like this.
Yeah, the claim here is that this J-Rod is from the Kingman crash, which is we've got a connection both with the name J-Rod, which Bill Uhouse uses, and also with the explicit claim that this J-Rod is from the crash in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. It's all connected, baby.
It's all connected.
I want we should in post put in the Pepe Silva meme behind me with the cork board and the red yarn connecting everything. Like the heat comes over here.
Oh my God.
So I am cutting out a lot of stuff here, but basically they have this very particular protocol about interacting with the alien. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase here. What I have picked up from kind of UFO lore is that the aliens are telepathic, but most humans have the potential to do telepathy, but aren't good at it or reject it. They have big walls up or they just don't hear it. So only certain humans are like capable of really conversing with them. And it tends to be that the ones that have a history of abduction in their family are more sensitive to this, either because the aliens have been like genetically preparing them for it, or they were investigating the family for that reason. But whatever, it tends to be, you get someone in a program who says, I was selected to be the psychic liaison with the alien because nobody else could do it. And my history had a family of abduction. This is a weirdly common thread.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Dan describes that they had this protocol that was clearly evolved by people who could not communicate with the alien, where you're supposed to get fully suited up in this fully sealed environment suit, step through the airlock, enter the sphere. You've got this hydraulic needle gun that punches a sample out of his arm. You're supposed to walk in, raise your right hand, say, I am the chosen human representative for this, test. And then the alien is supposed to also raise his right hand and present his arm to you. And everything is very by the fucking numbers. And there's a control room up here where they're all watching you do this, Dan says he and J-Rod found this whole process hilarious because J-Rod would start talking to him as soon as he was in the area, getting suited up. They're chit-chatting and stuff. And then he has to come in and raise his hand hey, J-Rod, I'm the... I'm yeah, man, I know. So he describes having this kind of relationship building with J-Rod. Sorry, I got lost in my notes. So he had a strong connection, Dan. So going back to the article, Dan eventually became accustomed to his new role, but on one occasion, while he was working directly with the J-Rod, there was a break in the protocol, and the J-Rod took a step towards Dan. This was still early enough in their working relationship that it startled Dan, who backed up, also a violation of protocol, and ended up catching his heel on the floor grate and falling backwards on all of his
That's why
filters
we have protocols.
and breathing equipment, right? The J-Rod jumps up on top of him, sat on his chest, and is projecting. They use the word download, which again is a common thing in the UFO world, where it's not psychic conversation in the sense that I hear a voice in my head and he's telling me things. It's more like in the Matrix, you just dump a bunch of information straight into your brain. So the J-Rod is on him, beaming all this stuff into his head, and Dan blacks out, and everybody's freaking the fuck out, and they've got to pull him out. And the story gets really weird after that. He starts talking about getting involved in MJ-12, and they're always pressing him to tell them what the alien told him, but he kind of won't for some reason. And Dan is even unclear in his own communication about what he learned. He told some of it, but he makes it clear there's a lot more about a coming cataclysm and stuff like that. Anyway, fucking wild. But yeah.
Yeah. So he jumps on his chest and starts downloading. I'm guessing this is a a proximity thing, psychic power is based on proximity. So what did he tell him?
Are you ready for this, buddy?
I've been ready.
All right. This is all a quote from an article. Okay. Quote, Burisch claims that there are two groups of J-Rods. Both are races of future humans who have traveled back in time to our world. One group, called the P45s, which is an abbreviation for present plus 45,000 years, come from 45,000 years in our future. Another group is called the P52s and come from 52,000 years in our future.
Okay.
The P52s are also called the Rogues.
Wait, and the P45s.
The P45s, thank you. The P45s are also called the Rogues and are self-serving in their agenda, which the P52s are not. According to Dan, the P45s are intent on justifying their history and want the catastrophe to occur, as this occurred in their history and was pivotal to creating them as a race. The purpose of the abduction program is a long-term longitudinal genetic drift study, which is aimed solely at benefiting their species. The P52s are more altruistic and have returned to attempt to help our present time situation. There's also a third group called the P52 Orions. These are also known in the UFO and contact reports as the Nordics and are much more human-looking and are a very spiritual race. The differences in physiology occurred after the catastrophe, which in our timeline has not yet happened, caused by one group, the P45 and P52 J-Rods, staying underground on Earth to survive in the post-apocalyptic world until eventually they migrated to Zeta Reticuli, while the other group, the P52 Orions, left Earth soon after the catastrophe to venture to the Moon and then Mars and then to other distant solar systems, which became their new home. Environmental and other factors created the marked difference in the two genomes. After several tens of thousands of years had passed, the P45 Orions were in good shape, while the P45 and P52 J-Rods had degenerated substantially.
Huh. Okay. Not gonna lie. I think I phased out a little bit during parts of that.
And buddy, that was the abbreviated version.
I noticed you talking faster and faster.
Oh my God. It's buck wild. I read a book about Dan Burisch years ago, and the part where he describes working in the facility and going through the airlock and interacting with the alien all felt very grounded and probable. And I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. And then it just goes off the fucking rails. I'm like, I don't know, man. So anyway, yeah. I hope at this point you understand why people in the UFO community got a little excited when Chris Mellon shares a screenshot from a government official saying they're getting access to the crash retrieval program and specifically mentions a recovered craft from Kingman, Arizona.
So, I'm not going to lie. I totally forgot that's where this episode started.
That's because I just took you on a freaking journey, my friend.
Yeah, through time. And
yeah,
anyway,
this whole story is a mess. It's an absolute mess. No one's really sure what parts to take seriously. So I completely understand. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading your notes. What am I doing?
It's okay. No. I mean, but yes, like I understand why Mellon popping in and giving it some credibility would be alluring, but it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
It's maddening.
It didn't go anywhere. His witness did not actually get access to the program or see the Kingman craft. But in a nutshell, my takeaway on this extremely messy story, which if you go look up 10 versions of the story, you will get 10 totally different versions of this story. My takeaway is we've got 3 witnesses who are kind of key to the story. First of all, we've got Arthur Stansel, who's a mechanical engineer, very credible witness, claims to have been taken in a blacked out bus in 1953 to a crash site where he saw an intact craft and a dead body. Okay, no problem. Then we've got Bill Uhouse, who claims to have spent 30 years from the 50s through the 80s building flight simulators for human-built flying saucers based on the one recovered in Kingman, and claims to have worked with an alien technical advisor named J-Rod, who may have been a crash survivor. And that brings us to Dan Burisch, who claims to have been involved in a medical program studying one of the Kingman survivors in the 90s, and that there are multiple groups of aliens who are all actually future humans traveling back in time.
Yeah. Once you crack open that door, like,
right?
Where do you draw the line? It's so interesting. So what do you find believable about this whole thing?
Burisch is a stretch too far for me. There are parts of his story that I like. I find it believable that if we had an alien survivor, we probably would have extremely rigid protocols and clean environments and sequestration and processes around interacting with it. That feels believable to me. Time travel, multiple warring groups of aliens coming back to influence us. He has a catastrophe, which is probably worth noting. He said was going to happen around 2007. And then later popped up to say, good news, guys, we averted the catastrophe.
Yay.
Convenient.
Or did we?
I don't know. I will say I don't blame anyone who finds Dan Burisch to be a bridge too far. Totally fine. I put him last for a reason. There's a kind of build-up in velocity here. Dan Burisch also comes much later than all the other witnesses and has clearly had time to be influenced by stories that were already out in the wild, such as the other witnesses and Lazar, and he's kind of riding the wave of the Area 51 hype in the early 90s. So it's fine if anybody's like, yeah, I don't buy Burisch. Bill Uhouse, I find to be a very interesting witness. He talks the way that someone who worked in these kind of programs would talk. And I should point out, I said about Stansel, they verified his employment history. They did the same thing for Uhouse. Uhouse worked in all the places he said he did. He was employed at Link Avionics. He did all these things. But of course, the cover story at Link is he's working on flight simulators for actual planes, not flying saucers.
Right.
So the way he talks about building a flying saucer feels realistic to me. But as you point out, there's some weird stuff here and some pretty big questions that if you're feeling charitable, you can say we're kind of getting the tip of the iceberg of a 30-year career working on very bizarre systems. If you're feeling less charitable, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's fine. I don't blame anyone for that. But I like that where his story overlaps with Stansel, they corroborate each other. And they came out close enough to each other in different enough circumstances that I don't believe they were influenced by each other. Who knows, of course, but, and then Stansel, I find extremely credible. Everything about his story about like being put on a bus and taken to a crash site, sworn to secrecy, that feels very plausible to me, given the premise that an alien vehicle crashed and the military is still kind of figuring their shit out. Yeah, bus in some experts and swear them to secrecy.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense if we're talking about a crashed US device, but a crashed flying saucer. Yeah, that process kind of makes sense to me.
Right. And like at that time, it really wouldn't be beyond the military to set up a staged thing like a UFO crash to find out who's going to talk about it.
Yeah. Who are the secret commies in the group?
Who are the commies? Like if they hear through their spy channels talk about flying saucers, they only have 15 people to talk to. Like
yeah, totally.
I don't know.
Now, I didn't get into any of there's so much more to the story. Uhouse tells a really funny story about how they removed the flying saucer from the crash location. Like, this is a 10-meter wide craft. They had to put it on a flatbed, but the crane couldn't pick it up because the gravity engine was still on. So like it wouldn't go the direction they wanted to do it. They eventually had
parking brake is still on.
Basically, he literally tells the story about later when the aliens said they wanted to go back to the craft, they like went inside and the humming that it had been making the whole time stopped. He described that in order to get it on the truck, they had to do what you do for moving a house. You just like jack it up progressively on blocks and back the truck under it. And even then, they had to take it across the dam, the Hoover Dam. There are light poles mounted on the dam, make it so that you cannot physically drive this thing across. So they had to put it on a barge. The cable broke and the barge drifted downriver and collided with the dam. Like, and then there are other witnesses who make even wilder claims about this.
That's such a mess.
It's a very, very, very messy story. Anyway, I'm sorry, I got derailed, man. What do you think?
I find I do find Stansel, like, there's few enough details that it feels very believable. It feels like he hasn't really extrapolated. But Uhouse feels like there were a couple details and then he went wild with it. And you know, of course, Burisch, like, I don't know. It was a wild time, the 70s.
Totally. It's probably worth mentioning Bill Uhouse, in his later years, became extremely racist to the point where the what was it, the Groom Lake Desert Rat, this like newsletter that had gone out to interview him repeatedly, they made a point of like, yeah, we don't talk to Bill Uhouse anymore, it is too uncomfortable. Like, we show up and he just starts telling us like his political beliefs, and it's like, bro, this is too much. So there is room here to understand and view Uhouse as an old man who's kind of excited to tell a story to people and kind of espouse his personal philosophies.
Yep.
That,
I mean, that's definitely the feeling I get from him.
Yeah.
Well, should we wrap up?
I think we should. Yeah. This has been quite an episode. I guess I want to say one more thing, which is,
go ahead.
We've said repeatedly that, and it's even in the intro to our show, right? Like, if this is real, what else? Like, it's a real problem with this field because there's so much misinformation and bullshit and wild claims out there. But if you accept one part of the story as legit, where do you draw the line? And it's
Right.
very unclear. And you're left doing what we've just done here. Well, I believe this guy, but not this guy. Well,
Yeah.
okay, why? Well, it kind of comes down to gut feel and stuff. But
Yeah.
like, I don't know, that part doesn't feel right. But 20 years ago, the idea that there were UFOs in the air was the wild claim.
Yeah.
That's now kind of table stakes. We kind of accept rather. There's absolutely room to disagree about whether they're extraterrestrial, but there's unquestionably bizarre, astonishing craft zipping around in our airspace, doing maneuvers that, to the best of our knowledge, no one on Earth is capable of doing. That kind of accepted as a fact now. Well, okay, if you accept that,
why not?
It's kind of hard to come up with an explanation that works better than non-human.
Right.
If they're non-human, well, why do I believe that it's okay that these craft are non-human, but the whole abduction narrative is a bridge too far? What about crop circles? What about Bigfoot? What about time travel? What about remote viewing? Like, there's so much peripheral stuff in this field that it's really tricky. You crack that door open, it's like, oh my God, I don't want to let everything in. And this story, I think, is kind of the perfect example of, we've got this progression in witnesses. Like, okay, you can accept that there's a crash retrieval program that the U.S. military is hiding. Oh yeah, totally. I believe the military is hiding something. And you can accept that they recovered a non-human vehicle from the desert in Arizona in the 50s. Yeah, I find that plausible. And you can accept that there were alien pilots to that. Well, sure. Maybe. And then we reverse engineered a human vehicle from that. Well, okay, yeah, I guess if they had it, they'd probably work on it. And they worked with one of the aliens as a technical advisor. Whoa, wait, what? Like, how did that work? And then they had to do medical experiments where the alien was locked in a glass bubble 4 stories underground, and he turned out to be somewhere along the line. We crossed that line, and I don't know where it was. Somewhere between here and there. We went too far.
Woo. Yeah. No. It is slippery, but I am looking forward to. So it feels like season 1 was like, all right, let's get Chuck acclimatized. Season 2 is like, all right, Chuck believes that something weird is in our airspace. Season 3 is going to be like, let's get weird. I think I don't know when season 3 starts.
Once you take the first step, it's all just like, come on, man.
Listen to this a little further.
Story I've got.
Come into this quicksand. It's very warm.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. You can find show notes and more on our website, veryexcitingtime.com, as well as links to our social media accounts.
Yeah, and you can feel free to email us at Scott or Chuck at Very Exciting Time. You can leave comments on the YouTube thing. And if you'd like to support the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/veryexcitingtime. And just a preview, the next Patreon, I think we're going to talk about the Chinese airport sightings and maybe even the alien interview tapes. So if you want to hear more about that.
All right. Was not expecting Chuck to bring that topic to me.
I know, right? Well, it wasn't me. It was just Patreon questions, What can I do?
And Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs so she doesn't have to.